Picture a room somewhere in Jerusalem. A scribe finishes a page and sets it down to dry. What he does next with that page will quietly change how an entire tradition reads the word wisdom. He has spent years gathering short sayings, some his own, some passed down, some collected from a king's court generations back. Now he has to decide how to open the collection, not what to say first, how to frame everything that follows. He could have opened with a command. Ancient wisdom writing usually did. Centuries before Solomon, the Babylonian king Hammurabi, ruling around 1750 BC, had his laws carved into a stone pillar taller than a man, so that anyone who walked past would know exactly who held the power to make them. Our scribe does something different. He writes 7 verses that read almost like a legal filing, a statement of purpose, an audience, a method, and then, at the very end of that filing, he does something that quietly rewrites what every sentence before it meant. Scholars who study this passage have a technical name for it. They call verses 1 through 7 a programmatic prologue, not just an introduction, but a set of instructions for how to read everything that comes after. That is Proverbs 1 through 7. And if you understand what happens inside it, you understand something that runs underneath the entire rest of the Bible. Start with the name of the book itself. In English, we call it Proverbs. In Hebrew, the name is Mishlei, and that word is not neutral. It comes from a root, mashal, that means to set one thing beside another, to compare, not to command, to compare. A mashal works like a mirror angled just slightly away from you. You expect to see the subject of the sentence, and instead you end up seeing yourself. Before the book has taught a single lesson, its own name has already told you what kind of authority it is claiming. Not the authority of an order, the authority of a reflection. Hold that thought, because verse 1 seems to undercut it immediately. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. A name, a lineage, a title. This is exactly the kind of authority claim Hammurabi made in stone. The message on the surface is identical. I am wise, therefore listen to me. So why does this scribe, writing in Solomon's name, spend the next 6 verses building toward a sentence that hands that authority somewhere else entirely? Verses 2 through 6 read almost like a mission statement. To know wisdom and discipline, to understand words of insight, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Even the wise, it says, should listen and add to their learning. This book claims to work on everyone, the beginner and the sage. No floor low enough, no ceiling high enough for what it claims to teach. Then verse 7 arrives, and the tone changes completely. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Stop there. Read that quickly and it sounds like a pious flourish tacked onto the end of an introduction. Read it slowly, and you notice it is not building on what came before. It is placed underneath it. Everything in verses 2 through 6, the wisdom, the discipline, the insight, the discretion. Verse 7 is telling you none of it stands on its own. It has a floor, and the floor is not intelligence. Look closely at the word translated fear. The Hebrew is yirah, and English gives us only one word for something Hebrew treats as at least 2 different experiences. There is pachad, the fear of a threat, the fear that makes you run, the fear you feel when something dangerous is closing in. Yirah is not that. Yirah is what you feel standing next to something so much larger than you that your own scale becomes obvious. When Abraham stands on a mountain in Genesis 22, the angel tells him, "Now I know you fear God, yirah," same root as yirah. He is not fleeing. He is standing perfectly still, having just seen exactly how small he is. That is the posture verse 7 is asking for. Not dread, recognition. Now look at the word right after it, because this is the detail almost every reader glides past without noticing. The verse does not say the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It says the beginning of knowledge. In Hebrew, those are 2 separate words, de'ahet and hokamah. And the difference is not decoration. Hokmah is skill. It is what a craftsman has, what a strategist has, what anyone with real expertise has. whether or not that person has any reverence for God at all. Dahat sits underneath skill. It is the raw capacity to perceive what is actually there before you have done anything clever with what you see. Proverbs 9:10, later in the book, will say the fear of the Lord is the beginning of Chokmah. Here, at the very opening, the scribe reaches for the more basic word first. That ordering is the argument. Before you can build wisdom, you need accurate perception. An accurate perception, this verse claims, does not come free. Take reverence away, and you are not simply less wise. You are looking at a distorted picture and mistaking it for a clear one. Think of it like a compass. Wisdom is the whole journey, every road taken, every shortcut avoided. But the fear of the Lord is the needle's relationship to true north. Remove that, and the compass does not stop working. It still spins. It still points somewhere with total confidence. It is simply wrong every time, and the person holding it has no way of knowing. That is who the fool is. And here the text is more exact than most readers expect. The fool is not someone who lacks access to wisdom. The Hebrew word for despise in verse 7, baz, means to look directly at something and judge it worthless. Not an information gap, a decision. The fool sees what reverence would require and decides the cost is not worth paying. Now go back to verse 2, to a word flattened in translation almost every time. Discipline, in Hebrew, musar. English hears discipline and thinks punishment. Musar is closer to formation. The shaping that happens when you let someone wiser than you correct your course and actually let it change you. Verse 4 uses another word worth pausing on, pathayim, translated simple, not stupid, open, unguarded. The scribe is telling you plainly who this book is written for first. People who have not yet learned to see the traps the world sets for them. So here is what those 7 verses are doing. Read as one argument instead of 7 separate lines. Verses 2 through 6 describe a book that claims to sharpen anyone at any level. Verse 7 then gives the terms and conditions. None of it works unless you accept something underneath it first. That your own perception is not, by default, trustworthy. And that trust has to be built on reverence, not on confidence in yourself. There is more sitting underneath Chokmah worth pausing on, because the word carries a history the English word wisdom does not. Trace it back through the Hebrew Bible, and you find it in strange company. The word used for the craftsmen who built the tabernacle. The word used for the magicians of Egypt, standing in front of Pharaoh, matching Moses trick for trick. Chokmah, by itself, is not moral. It is competence. A craftsman has it. A sorcerer has it. Anyone skilled enough to do something well has it, regardless of what they do with that skill. That is why verse 7 will not let Chokmah stand alone, and why it reaches underneath it for yirah first. Skill without reverence is still skill. It can build a tabernacle or deceive a king, and from the outside the two can look identical. What separates them is not talent. It is what the talent is submitted to. Now go back to verse 3, to a line easy to read past because it sounds like filler. To receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity. 4 words stacked together, and none of them decorative. A con artist can be clever. A tyrant can be strategic. Verse 3 draws a line most readers never notice. Real Chokmah, the kind rooted in yirah, always bends toward what is right. If it does not bend that way, whatever it is not what this book means by wisdom. Here is where the scribe's choice of audience turns interesting again. Verse 5 says, even the wise should listen and add to their learning, not read. Listen. In a culture where scrolls were rare and expensive, most people met these sayings the way you meet a conversation. Spoken, repeated, absorbed by ear over years. Listening asks something reading does not. It asks you to sit still while someone else's words land on you, unedited, in their order, at their pace. That is a small act of yirah built into the method itself. The wise person, according to this scribe, is not the one who already has the answer. It is the one still willing to sit and listen for it. Widen the lens for a moment. Across the same centuries, Egyptian scribes were producing very similar material. The instruction of Amen Mo Pay is the text scholars set beside Proverbs most often, full of the same practical advice about speech, money, and restraint, and close enough to chapters later in this very book that some verses read almost like a shared draft. What none of those other texts do is what verse 7 does. They build a case for practical intelligence and stop there. This scribe builds the same case, and then, at the exact point where every other wisdom text of his era would have ended, adds one sentence underneath all of it. That single addition is the difference between a manual and a manifesto. It is worth asking, honestly, when any of this was actually written down. Some scholars place these opening verses in Solomon's own century, the 10th before Christ. Others argue the book's final shape came together centuries later, closer to the 4th or 3rd century before Christ, gathered by editors working long after Solomon was gone. The honest answer is that no one can date it with certainty, and the case this chapter makes does not depend on the date. It depends on the argument, and the argument stands the same age either way. Carry that argument into the rest of the book, and the design becomes visible in the numbers themselves. Chapters 2 through 9 read as one continuous address, a parent walking a child through the specific temptations that will try to buy his attention before he is old enough to recognize the price. Chapters 10 through 29 shift into something else, short, self-contained comparisons, often a single verse each, almost no connective tissue between them. Read enough in a row and a rhythm emerges. Observation, then implication, then silence, leaving you to finish the thought yourself. That silence is not an accident. A mashal only works if it leaves room for your own reflection, and a proverb that explained itself completely would stop being a mirror and become a lecture. Then, at the end, two final voices arrive. Agur, in chapter 30, confessing he does not have all the answers before he says anything else, and Lemuel, in chapter 31, passing on what his mother taught him. Neither is Solomon. Both still count. The book that opened by handing its authority to God rather than to a king closes the same way. None of that architecture holds without verse 7 underneath it. Take reverence out of the equation, and chapters 2 through 29 collapse into exactly what critics of religious wisdom literature have always accused it of being: practical tips dressed in solemn language. Leave verse 7 in place, and the same chapters become what the scribe claimed for them at the start. Not tips, but a way of seeing that has to be earned before it can be used. You can trace this same shape through the rest of the Bible if you know where to look. In Genesis, the tree in the garden is never called the tree of ignorance. It is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what Adam and Eve reach for is not information. It is the right to decide for themselves what counts as wise, apart from any reverence for the one who planted the garden. In Job, a man the text explicitly calls someone who feared God and turned from evil runs directly into suffering his intelligence cannot explain, and the whole book sits inside the gap between what he perceives and what he can reason through. In the Gospels, Jesus tells his disciples again and again that they do not yet see, not that they lack facts, but that something in how they are looking is still off. And in Matthew 11, he thanks the Father for hiding things from the wise and revealing them to children, because a child's posture toward what it does not understand tends to sit closer to yirah than a scholar's ever does. All of that is already sitting inside 7 verses, waiting for someone to notice the turn. So here is a question worth carrying with you longer than it takes to answer it. Not where are you uninformed? Where are you choosing to trust your own reading of things over the reverence this verse says has to come first? That is not a question with a tidy answer. It is a question you live inside for a while. The scribe in Jerusalem set his pen down knowing he could not make that choice for anyone reading after him. He could only build the mirror and hand it over. What you do with your own reflection in it is the part the book was never going to write for you.